You know, I wandered around here for 30 years in the Congress and haven't been back here much. So I will tell all of you that when you leave, as you all will someday, the thing you miss is having the opportunity every day to work with your friends in the Senate and the House. And so it's good to see all of you. And I'm here because Senator Heitkamp asked whether I would come and testify on her legislation. I'm happy to do that. What she and Senator Murkowski have introduced, I think, has great merit. I'm pleased to see Senator Hoeven as well and know of your legislation, which I also think has merit. And so I want to talk just a bit today about the legislation that has been introduced by Senator Heitkamp and Senator Murkowski. But let me say immediately the question that people might ask is, well, why this? Why another commission? Why another study? Frankly, I think this commission is complementary to everything that is going on. I'm the co-chair of the task force by the U.S. Justice Department on violence on Indian reservations with children. This is perfectly complementary to that. This is complementary to the Center for Native American Youth, which I created, and we work every day on a range of these issues. This complements that. And, you know, I kind of see this as taking a step back with collective, fresh eyes from the nation about what do we see here, and how do we finally get our arms around it. It's kind of like a diagnosis. You know, it's one thing to talk about these things. How do you better diagnose what it is and how you fix it? Now, we know that there are children at risk in this country, Native American children especially. We know of all the population that's been left behind. In my judgment, none have been left behind more quickly than American Indian children. And, you know, this despite the fact that all of these promises that have been made, all the treaties that have been signed, all the trust responsibility that bears on our shoulders, despite all of that, these kids have been left behind. And, you know, the fact is it's a national disgrace. Poverty rates, high school dropouts, teen suicides, you can just go on and on and on to describe the circumstances that face these kids. And I want to mention to you just 3 children that have symbolized for me the urgency with which all of us work on these issues. The first, Senator Heitkamp has seen this, but this is from February 4th, 1990. And I remember it the day it came out in the newspaper because it's a photograph of a young child, 3 years old, and this young girl named Tamara Demiris, she was put in a home, a foster home, by the way, by a social worker that was working 125 separate cases, and a drunken party ensued, and this young girl had her leg broken, her arm broken, her nose broken, and her hair pulled out at the roots at age 3. She likely will bear those scars all of her life. But this persuaded me to go to that reservation in February 1990 to find out what in the hell is going on. And so it still happens across this country. Despite all of our best efforts, we still see these problems. I was on the Pine Ridge Reservation about a year ago, and I went to a shelter, and I met a 12-year-old girl. At age 12, this young girl faced the following. Mother was dead from drug abuse, didn't know who her father was. She'd been in 2 foster homes, sexually abused in both. And now, at age 12, was finally, at long last, safe in a shelter. And that shelter was facing the ignorance of sequestration, which cuts the funding for the most vulnerable people in this country. Unbelievable. I stood in that room looking at this 12-year-old girl thinking, how can this country allow this to happen? Mr. Chairman, you and I were on the Crow Reservation when the grandmother of Tashawn Rain Littlelight walked forward in the crowd and held high above her head a photograph of her granddaughter, Tashawn Rain Littlelight, who died in her mother's arms. She died of cancer, and she'd been to the healthcare facilities at the IHS on their reservation time and time again, and was treated for depression until she died of cancer. These three young children I described to you all suffer in what I think is a national disgrace, a circumstance where, this is not some mysterious illness. We can fix this, but it's important to step back as the commission proposed by Senator Heitkamp and Senator Murkowski offer to do. Step back and take a look at all of these elements and then try to see if we can put them together in a rational way that addresses the issues that we know cause these problems. Mr. Chairman, I created an organization called the Center for Native American Youth. And that organization focuses on teen suicide prevention, education opportunity, and more. This commission is complementary to what we do every day. This commission will, in my judgment, be very, very helpful. This commission talks about the barriers, the obstacles, trying to evaluate explicitly what are the elements that we can put together that finally address the heart of this matter. And we know it's poverty, it's dysfunctional homes, it's gangs that prey on these kids, and drug issues, and so on. We know all of that, but we don't seem to have the capability to put together the solution that I think, or at least the set of recommendations that can come from this piece of legislation. One of the things that they're talking about is evaluating what are all the federal agencies doing. It's interesting to me that, I've been involved, as all of you have, in so many different pieces of legislation. Well, at the Center for Native American Youth, which is downtown here in Washington, D.C., we do a quarterly meeting and ask the federal agencies to come, and they come. And sitting around a table, about 30 of them, 25 to 30 agencies, and it's the first time they've ever sat around a table together, all of them working on Indian issues, all of them working on issues dealing with Indian children, none of them ever having met before to talk about what they're doing. And we discovered at the same table that two federal agencies were doing exactly the same thing on one reservation, spending a lot of money, and neither knew the other was there. Isn't that interesting? Well, not very interesting. It's pretty depressing. And so that's why this legislation will get at all of those issues. And it's why I think this legislation has very substantial merit. I do want to mention to you that in some ways, I hope that the way this is written, and as I read it, I think it's possible, that you might also, as an adjunct, decide to chronicle the promises, the treaties, the signatures, the trust, and everything. Put it all together to evaluate what has been promised and proposed in law and in treaty. And so these are solemn promises by the government. And then what has been done relative to those promises? We know, for example, 50% of the health care that was promised is not met. Full-scale rationing for health care for all Indians, including children. It should be front-page headline news on the Washington Post today, but it's not, because it happens every day. Just full-scale health care rationing. It ought to bring tears to everybody's eyes. Now, finally, let me just say that the overriding issue is funding. And it's easy to talk about and very hard to solve. But the funding issue for foster care, for social services, for education, for housing, for health care, as I've just described, the funding issues are chronic. And we just have to find a way to get at it. So let me conclude by saying this. When we talk about all these things, I held some hearings, for example, on teen suicide. And I was told by parents and others, don't do this. Don't have public hearings on this subject, because it's something that obviously we're ashamed of. It's a stain. Don't do this. I said, we don't have any choice. This continues to happen. We have to shine all the spotlights on one spot and figure out not only what's happening, but how on earth do we fix it. So my sense is that if we can use this commission as well to chronicle all those promises that have been made, and then all the underfunding that exists in these areas, to try to figure out how do we button this up and finally, with recommendations and best practices, give some of these children some hope for the future. Parents care about this, tribal officials care about this, and when we talk about it, I don't want anybody to think that there are tribal chairmen and tribal council members that don't care. They do. They work very hard. So do parents to try to fix these things, but they need our help, because we're the ones that made the promise and we're the ones not keeping it. So, again, finally, let me say this commission idea is complementary to everything else that's going on, but I think may well get us way down the road in terms of a new diagnosis and new prescriptions about how we finally fix this in a different way. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for inviting me.